Lords. I want to really thank the Noble Lord Earl Howe for raising the issue around theatres. And this is one of those peculiar issues, which is, why on earth would you do this? I think it's a good question. What is the problem with the present circumstances? But I think it just reminded me of the previous group, because this is something that could compromise artistic freedom for no particular good reason. And in the previous group, I suddenly envisaged advertising designers and product designers being rounded up and facing 2 years in prison at some point. And I think that what it speaks of is the dangers of, as it were, getting the state being drunk on power. It's like as though state overreach gets carried away with itself. We are righteous, on a good cause, on a mission, we're very zealous, and suddenly all sorts of important norms get kind of thrown out of the window. And I think that the noble lady, the minister, who I know is personally very reasonable, but I do think that sometimes legislation gets carried away with itself, and I would suggest that this legislation needs to have a fine-tooth comb kind of run through it to kind of get rid of these disproportionate, maybe unintended consequences. I think once that happens, it then encourages others to also put in amendments that kind of makes a virtue of such state overreach. So I completely support the previous speech, and I'm opposed to the Amendment 180, which is dealing with a very small, which is absolutely a huge hammer to deal with a very small issue that isn't even a problem, but somehow can get lumped in with everything else. And I just very quickly wanted to say that I'm also opposed to Amendment 186, which is the notion that hospitality venues would, that pavement licences will only be granted by local authorities subject to the condition that smoking is prohibited. So I wanted to just kind of give a certain reminder to the Chamber and to my Lords. Hospitality is absolutely under the cosh. We spend a lot of time worrying about the fate of the high street. I am involved in lots of discussions at the moment about fragmenting communities, people not going out and about and socialising. We really worked hard as a society, we had to work hard to get people back socialising with each other after the terrible lockdown period. And even now, hospitality has really found it hard to recover, and there's all sorts of economic reasons for that. So it seems to me to be ludicrous to say that payment licences will only be granted by local authorities where you can sit out and enjoy yourself and meet your friends and so on, if smoking is prohibited. Individual establishments might decide to prohibit smoking. That's up to them. That's entirely their freedom to do so. And people who smoke won't go to them. Or if there are hospitality who have seating outside, payment licences granted, and some of the spaces you're allowed to smoke or vape in them, and then other parts are. In other words, grown-ups negotiate their way around this. And I, for one, enjoy that society has found cafe society and coming out onto pavements. And I think that it is really misanthropic and mean-spirited to try and stamp on that in any way whatsoever. And I therefore completely opposed to 186. But it's kind of in the spirit of this kind of like relentless, never-ending attempt at banning, regulating, stopping all the time. I also think, by the way, that it's an terrible insult to local authorities' autonomy to say that they have telling them what to do in this way. It seems ridiculously petty-minded and authoritarian both at the same time. I did just want to also, just because evidence is there and this sort of notion that, it relates to both the previous group but also to this idea of kind of the dangers of smoking outside. I just wanted to remind that Cancer Research Notes warns that it's important to consider how, and this is in relation to passive smoking and smoking outside, it says it's important to consider how to avoid stigma that would risk pushing people into smoking in their homes, which would increase second-hand smoke exposure to those living with it. I only want to make the point, which is, if you take the approach that the public square, that the state decides that the public square is its own, the state just imagines it can sanitise it of all the kind of things that it doesn't want the public to do, which actually is not a free society, by the way, then actually, ironically, there can be, in this instance, unintended consequences, which is you push people into the antisocial home, in some ways, where if you're a smoker, you'll smoke. And you might as well let them outside. But, of course, there are some people here who don't want that either. But, unless, as I've said, you have the courage to make smoking a criminal offence, then I think that you have to have a certain sense of proportion and allow smoking outside in some instances, and in my instance, on the cafes outside, if that establishment allows you to.